Slow down. There are places on this planet where human presence becomes negligible, where the landscape itself absorbs noise, dissolves intention, reshapes meaning, where ice doesn't just cover ground, it defines it. And in the architecture of power, these places sometimes matter more than cities ever could. Geography is not neutral. It never has been. A strait becomes a choke point. A peninsula becomes a platform. An island becomes a question. And when that island sits between three continents, when it commands access to an ocean that is slowly, methodically opening, when it holds resources that have spent millennia locked beneath ice, it stops being just an island. This is not a story about Greenland as most people imagine it. This is not about glaciers melting into documentary footage. This is not about indigenous communities featured in Sunday supplements. This is not about climate change as a tragedy. This is about what happens when silence becomes strategically expensive, when emptiness becomes contested, when a territory with fewer people than a mid-sized European city becomes a pressure point in calculations made thousands of kilometers away. Greenland is enormous. Not enormous in the way nations typically measure themselves by population, by industrial output, by military capability, but enormous in the way that redefines maps. 2 million square kilometers, 80% ice, 56,000 people. Numbers that suggest irrelevance, numbers that suggest a place the world could forget. And yet, for decades, Greenland occupied a particular category in geopolitical consciousness. It was administered by Denmark. It held an American military installation. It existed in frameworks inherited from Cold War positioning. It appeared occasionally in strategic documents. It did not demand attention. It was simply there, frozen, peripheral, understood. That understanding is changing. Not through announcement, not through crisis, through attention, through interest that surfaces in remarks that are framed as casual, transactional, almost throwaway, through language that treats sovereignty as negotiable real estate rather than constitutional permanence. Some observers quietly note the timing. They note how renewed interest in Greenland does not emerge from nowhere. It emerges alongside shifting Arctic dynamics, alongside melting ice that reveals shipping routes thought impossible a generation ago, alongside mineral deposits becoming accessible, alongside military installations being modernized, alongside conversations about strategic positioning that have become louder, more explicit, more unfiltered. This attention did not arrive suddenly. It arrived quietly, through incremental statements, through diplomatic remarks that tested boundaries of conventional discourse, through suggestions that ownership itself could be reconsidered if the price, the arrangement, the strategic logic aligned correctly. And beneath these suggestions sits a fundamental recalculation. The Arctic is no longer frozen permanence. It is becoming a theater, not a theater of war in the traditional sense. No armies massing, no fleets converging, but a theater of preparation, of positioning, of presence. Consider the geography itself. Greenland sits between North America and Europe. It commands approaches to the Arctic Ocean from the Atlantic. It offers surveillance positions over routes that connect continents. It holds territory that, in an era of contested polar access, becomes more valuable precisely because it is empty, because emptiness can be filled according to someone else's requirements. The resources locked beneath Greenland's ice sheet are not speculative. They are documented. Rare earth elements critical to technology supply chains, uranium deposits that remain undeveloped, potential oil and gas reserves mapped but not yet exploited. Resources that, in another era, might have seemed too difficult to extract, too expensive, too remote. But infrastructure changes calculations. Climate patterns change calculations. Geopolitical competition changes calculations. What was once uneconomical becomes feasible. What was once inaccessible becomes reachable. What was once irrelevant becomes contested. It is difficult to ignore the coincidence. The renewed interest in Greenland emerges precisely as Arctic ice retreats at rates faster than models predicted, as shipping routes through northern waters become viable for longer portions of the year, as nations begin establishing permanent research stations, expanding military facilities, conducting exercises in waters previously considered impassable. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state, a designation with no formal meaning but significant implication. Russia has militarized its Arctic coastline more extensively than at any point since the Cold War ended. Norway, Canada, the United States, all have increased their northern deployments, their surveillance capabilities, their readiness postures. And in the middle of these movements, Greenland exists, not as an actor, not as a participant in these decisions, but as a location, as a coordinate set, as a territory whose future may be determined by conversations occurring elsewhere. The relationship between Greenland and Denmark has evolved over decades. From colonial administration to home rule to increasing autonomy, Greenland controls most of its domestic affairs. Denmark handles foreign policy and defense. But this arrangement, like all arrangements, functions only as long as the underlying assumptions hold. And those assumptions are being tested, not through formal challenge, not through legal dispute, through something more direct, through statements that suggest sovereignty itself is conditional, that territories, regardless of constitutional frameworks, can be reconsidered if strategic necessity demands it. These statements have been made publicly, not as policy proposals, not as official doctrine, but as ideas introduced into discourse, as possibilities floated without commitment, as suggestions that blur the line between negotiation and expectation. Some observers describe this as transactional thinking applied to geopolitics, the notion that everything territories, alliances, treaties exists within a framework of deals to be made, positions to be traded, arrangements to be optimized. Others describe it more carefully, as a form of pressure that operates without ultimatum, that signals interest without declaring intention. Greenland's population has not been consulted in the way populations are typically consulted about their own future. The conversations happen in capitals far away, in Brussels, in Washington, in Copenhagen, in Beijing, in Moscow. The people who live on the island itself become secondary to the calculations being made about the island. This is not unique to Greenland. History is filled with territories whose fate was decided elsewhere. But what makes this moment distinct is the transparency. The statements are not hidden in classified documents. They surface in press conferences, in social media posts, in interviews conducted casually as if discussing real estate rather than sovereignty. And beneath this transparency sits a question that no one has fully answered. What happens when a major power decides it requires access to a territory, frames that requirement as strategic necessity, and encounters resistance? The mechanisms available range widely: economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, security guarantees offered or withdrawn, infrastructure investments positioned as partnership but structured as dependency, military presence expanded under existing agreements, then gradually normalized, then incrementally increased until the original terms become unrecognizable. None of this requires invasion. None of this requires war. It requires patience. It requires leverage. It requires the understanding that smaller entities, even those with formal sovereignty, operate within constraints they did not choose. Greenland's autonomy is real. Its institutions function. Its government makes decisions within its jurisdiction, but autonomy exists within context. And when that context shifts, when the strategic value of a territory increases beyond its capacity to defend that value independently, autonomy becomes negotiable. The American military installation at Thule Air Base has existed since the 1950s. It monitors missile launches. It tracks satellites. It provides early warning capabilities. This represents a presence established when Greenland had even less voice than it does now. A presence that has been maintained, upgraded, expanded according to requirements determined elsewhere. Some quietly note how modernization of this facility has accelerated, how new radar systems have been installed, how personnel rotations have increased, how the base, once described as minimal in legacy, has become central to Arctic defense architecture. This expansion occurs under existing agreements. It does not violate treaties. It does not breach sovereignty, but it establishes facts on the ground. It creates infrastructure that outlasts political arrangements. It builds dependencies that become difficult to reverse. And while this infrastructure develops, conversations about Greenland's future intensify, not as formal negotiations, not as diplomatic protocols, but as ideas circulating in strategic circles, ideas about purchase, about lease arrangements, about security partnerships that gradually transform governance structures. The language used is important. It avoids conquest. It avoids occupation. It frames everything as transaction, as mutual benefit, as strategic necessity that serves everyone's interests. But beneath this language sits a fundamental imbalance. One party requires the territory. The other party lives on it. Greenland's government has responded with clarity. It has stated repeatedly that the island is not for sale, that sovereignty is not negotiable, that any discussions about future arrangements must respect self-determination. These statements are principled. They are consistent. They are also delivered from a position of limited leverage, because the attention Greenland receives is not simply about Greenland. It is about Arctic access, about resource security, about military positioning in an era of renewed great power competition, about ensuring that strategic territories do not fall under the influence of rivals. And in this framework, Greenland becomes instrumental. It becomes a space to be secured, a position to be held, a resource to be controlled or denied to others. The resources are significant. The rare earth deposits alone have been estimated as among the largest undeveloped reserves globally. These elements are critical for electronics, for renewable energy technology, for military systems. Currently, supply chains for these materials run through a small number of countries. Diversifying those supply chains becomes a strategic imperative. Greenland offers that diversification, but extraction requires infrastructure, processing facilities, transportation networks, investment at scales beyond what a territory of 56,000 people can mobilize independently, which creates openings, which creates dependencies, which creates arrangements that begin as partnerships and evolve into something less equal. Some observers frame this as inevitable. They argue that Greenland's strategic value exceeds its capacity for independent action. That alignment with larger powers is not subordination but pragmatism. That accepting investment, accepting security guarantees, accepting gradual integration is simply recognizing reality. Others frame it differently, as pressure disguised as opportunity, as sovereignty eroded through financial mechanisms rather than military force, as self-determination constrained by arrangements that appear voluntary but operate under conditions of fundamental inequality. Both framings may be true simultaneously. This is the nature of pressure that operates without ultimatum. It creates situations where refusal carries costs, where acceptance carries consequences, where the distinction between choice and constraint becomes impossible to identify clearly. The broader Arctic context amplifies these dynamics. Russia controls the longest Arctic coastline and has invested heavily in militarizing it. China seeks access to shipping routes and resources despite having no Arctic territory. The United States views the region as critical to homeland defense and global positioning. European nations balance economic interests with security concerns. And Greenland sits at the intersection of these competing interests, not because it chose this position, because geography assigned it. The melting ice accelerates everything. Shipping routes that were theoretical become practical. Resources that were inaccessible become viable. Military positions that were secondary become primary. And the timeline compresses. What seemed like gradual, manageable change becomes urgent, contested, immediate. This urgency manifests in increased activity, naval exercises in Arctic waters, research stations expanding into year-round facilities, territorial claims being reasserted or newly filed, diplomatic language becoming sharper, more explicit, more willing to acknowledge competition. And within this acceleration, Greenland cannot simply opt out. It cannot declare neutrality and be respected. It cannot refuse engagement and be left alone. Its location makes it relevant regardless of its preferences. Some quietly note that this attention, this pressure, this positioning, it all occurs while maintaining frameworks of international law, while respecting formal sovereignty, while operating through diplomatic channels and economic mechanisms rather than military action, which makes it more difficult to resist, because there is no invasion to rally against, no occupation to oppose, no clear violation to protest. Just attention, just interest, just suggestions that accumulate into expectations. The infrastructure development continues, the investment proposals multiply, the security arrangements deepen, and with each development, Greenland becomes more integrated into systems it did not design, serving purposes it did not choose, fulfilling roles determined by calculations made elsewhere. This is not conquest, this is not colonialism in its historical form, but it shares structural similarities, the same imbalance of power, the same framing of arrangement as mutual benefit, the same outcome where one party's sovereignty becomes conditional on another's approval, and perhaps most significantly, it demonstrates how geopolitical pressure operates in the current era, not through declarations of intent, not through military campaigns announced and executed, but through incremental positioning, through infrastructure that creates dependencies, through economic arrangements that constrain choices, through security partnerships that gradually transform governance. Greenland did not ask to become a signal. It did not volunteer to demonstrate how power thinks ahead, how strategic calculation operates over decades rather than years, how territories with minimal voice can matter enormously to those making decisions about the future shape of global order. But that is what it has become, a place where the gap between formal sovereignty and actual autonomy becomes visible, where the difference between partnership and subordination blurs, where the future is being determined not by those who live there, but by those who have decided it matters. The conversations continue, the attention does not fade, the positioning intensifies, and Greenland remains. 56,000 people on 2 million square kilometers of ice, watching as their home becomes a coordinate in calculations they cannot control, serving purposes they did not choose, valued not for what it is but for where it sits. The ice continues melting, the routes continue opening, the resources continue waiting, and the attention continues arriving, patient and methodical, understanding that some forms of acquisition require neither announcement nor apology, only time, only presence, only the quiet certainty that geography, in the end, outweighs everything else.